right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to do a deep dive just for you.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, you sent in some really interesting stuff, and we're
Huh.
going to kind of synthesize it, make it make sense, pull out the important points.
Yeah.
And we're going to be focusing mostly on Judson Brewer's book, Unwinding Anxiety.
That's a good one. I like how it kind of blends personal anecdotes and stories with the hard science.
Yeah, for
Okay.
sure.
Yeah.
And I think the thing that we're going to try to do with this deep dive is to uh, give you a more actionable, understandable picture of anxiety without like overwhelming you with information.
Yeah.
So I guess to start off, maybe let's talk about like how anxiety actually feels, because I think that the book does a really good job of kind of making it relatable through these these different people's stories, right?
Right. Right. So the author himself, Judson Brewer, talks about his own experiences with panic attacks when he was a resident.
Oh, wow.
And, think about being a resident. You're sleep deprived. You're always feeling like maybe you're not good enough and you're on call. There's all this uncertainty.
Yeah.
And he found that mindfulness was actually a really powerful tool for him. It helped him to deal with those really intense moments. And more importantly, it actually helped him to not develop a full-blown panic disorder.
Wow. It's like he kind of nipped it in the bud, he was able to use those tools right away.
Yeah, and that was what sort of led him to realize that he could teach these skills to other people too.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then there's another person in the book, Mari, and she talks about, generalized anxiety.
Oh, okay.
And she describes it as this kind of low-grade feeling that doesn't really have any specific object, but it kind of attaches itself to various situations.
Oh, interesting.
And she talks about how she initially just thought it was normal nervousness,
Mm-hmm.
about the big changes that were happening in her life,
Yeah.
which, in a way it was. But she eventually realized that it was actually generalized anxiety.
It's almost like your mind's looking for something to latch onto, like to worry about.
Yeah, exactly. It's
Yeah.
always there in the background. And it can be really insidious because it doesn't always feel like a problem you need to address
Yeah.
until it sort of builds up.
Until it builds up. Yeah.
Yeah. And then we have Emily, who talks about anxiety being like a tea kettle.
Oh, okay.
You know how a tea kettle kind of builds up pressure and then it blows?
Right. Yeah.
That's how she describes her anxiety. It's like this buildup of tension that eventually just explodes. And it often happens at night, when everything's quiet.
Really? That's so interesting because it's so different, from Mari's experience.
Right. That's one of the things that the book really emphasizes,
Yeah.
is that anxiety can manifest so differently in different people.
Right.
And that the first step to really working with it is to recognize how it shows up for you.
That makes sense. So, like, if you think about your own experience, how does your anxiety tend to show up?
Yeah, is it more like that constant undercurrent, or is it more like those sudden bursts?
Or is it like something totally different?
Those are like totally different.
Yeah. And I think, the book also talks about how anxiety exists on a spectrum.
Right. It can range from everyday nervousness
Yeah.
to panic attacks to these more chronic anxiety disorders like generalized anxiety disorder.
Right, like GAD, right?
Yeah, GAD, panic disorder, phobias, OCD.
Right, yeah.
But one thing that I really liked was Brewer's perspective on it. He says it's not necessarily a defect.
Oh, okay.
It's more like a violin string that's slightly out of tune.
I like that.
Yeah.
It's not broken, it just needs a little bit of...
It just needs a little adjustment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, okay, so we've talked about how it feels, but what about, like, the roots of anxiety? Where does it all begin?
Well, the book really emphasizes the role of fear and uncertainty. Fear is, it's an evolutionary mechanism, right? It's designed to keep us safe.
Right.
Like, imagine you're about to step into the street and you almost get hit by a car.
Yeah.
That jolt of fear,
Mm-hmm.
it teaches you to be more careful around streets in the future.
Right, it's like a learning experience.
Right, and this learning process is actually really simple. A cue, a behavior, and a result.
Okay.
It's so basic that even sea slugs, with their really simple nervous systems, learn this way.
Wow. But then anxiety comes in, and the book suggests that anxiety arises when our prefrontal cortex, that part of our brain that helps us plan and make decisions, doesn't have enough information to accurately predict what's going to happen.
Right, and I think the early days of the pandemic are a really good example of this.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
There was this new virus, and scientists were still trying to figure out how it spread, how dangerous it was.
Yeah.
And in the absence of that information, our brains basically filled in the gaps with fear.
Yeah, it makes sense. Our brain's like trying to make sense of it, and it's like, well, this must be really bad.
Right. And we know that bad news tends to stick in our minds more than good news.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
it's like this perfect storm for anxiety,
So we've got this uncertainty about the virus itself, about our jobs, about our kids.
about the economy,
Everything, right?
everything. Yeah.
It's like our brains are overloaded.
Yeah. And, the natural response to uncertainty is to seek more information.
Right.
But
Yeah.
here's the thing.
Yeah.
In our modern world, that can actually backfire
Oh, interesting.
because we have access to so much information, and a lot of it is contradictory. Some of it is even intentionally misleading.
It's like information overload almost.
Right. The book talks about how fake news spreads way faster than real news.
Wow, yeah. So instead of feeling more in control, we end up feeling even more anxious.
Exactly. It's like trying to drink from a bottomless glass of water.
Oh, I like that.
You're never going to quench your thirst. Yeah. And, the book even talks about how this need for certainty can lead to things like parents putting tracking devices on their kids,
Oh, interesting.
which, on the surface, it seems like it's about safety,
Right.
but it can actually make the parents more anxious.
Because they're constantly getting all this data.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they start imagining all these worst case scenarios.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So more information doesn't always equal more peace of mind.
Right.
Sometimes it just creates more anxiety.
Yeah. So anxiety starts with this discomfort with the unknown, and then our attempts to kind of fix that can actually make it worse.
Yeah, that's a really important point.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on a little bit. How does anxiety turn into a habit?
This is where the book gets really interesting. Brewer talks about these things called habit loops.
Okay.
It's a cycle of trigger, behavior, reward.
Right.
And he explains how anxiety can become part of these loops.
Okay.
So let's talk about reward-based learning and dopamine. When we do something that feels good, our brain releases dopamine,
Yeah.
and that makes us want to do it again.
Right. It's like, hey, this was good. Let's remember this.
Exactly. Like, imagine a cave person finding food.
Okay. Yeah.
That's a huge reward because it's essential for survival.
Right.
So the brain's like, okay, remember where you found this food. Remember how you got it.
Right.
Trigger. See food. Behavior. Beat food.
Right.
Reward. Survival.
Yeah.
Feeling good. Repeat.
Okay. Yeah.
Now, fast forward to today.
Yeah.
We don't have to worry about finding food the same way,
Right.
but our brains still work the same way.
Right.
So let's say you've had a really stressful day
Yeah.
and you're feeling down and you remember there's a chocolate bar in the cupboard.
Yeah.
Your brain might be like, hey, that chocolate will make you feel better.
Yeah. It's comfort food.
Right. So the trigger is stress, the behavior is eating chocolate, and the reward is that temporary feeling of comfort, that dopamine hit.
Yeah. It's like a quick fix.
Exactly.
And then the cycle repeats, right?
And then the cycle repeats.
Yeah.
And the crazy thing is that the modern world is basically designed to exploit this.
Oh, wow.
The food industry makes food that's super addictive.
There's all that sugar and fat and salt. Yeah.
Yeah. Social media keeps us scrolling. News uses clickbait headlines.
Yeah.
It's all about instant gratification.
Right.
And this even applies to our thoughts.
Oh, interesting.
The book talks about the worry cycle.
Okay.
So you feel an unpleasant emotion, and then you start worrying.
Yeah.
Your brain thinks that worry is going to help you solve the problem,
Right.
or at least distract you from it.
Yeah.
But if the worry doesn't actually lead to a solution,
Yeah.
it just creates more anxiety.
All right. It's like a vicious cycle.
Exactly. It's anxiety triggering worry, triggering more anxiety.
That's basically what generalized anxiety disorder is, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's one way of looking at it.
Yeah.
And the problem is that once these loops become ingrained, they're really hard to break.
Yeah. So the first step is to just become aware of them, to see them for what they are.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about how anxiety feels, where it comes from, and how it becomes a habit.
Now what do we do about it?
Right, yeah. Now let's get into Brewer's 3-gear approach.
Okay.
So first gear is mapping your mind.
This is all about awareness.
Okay.
It's about identifying those habit loops that we were just talking about.
Okay.
What's the trigger? What's the behavior? And what's the result?
Right.
The book tells this story about a guy named John who was struggling with alcoholism.
Okay.
And he realized through mapping his habit loops that his drinking was actually fueled by anxiety about his work.
Oh, interesting.
The work stress made him procrastinate. The procrastination made him more anxious. And then he would drink to cope.
Yeah.
Just by mapping it out, he started to see that the drinking was actually making his anxiety worse.
Oh,
And he was actually able to stop drinking completely just from that awareness.
that's amazing.
Yeah, it was a huge turning point for him.
So the act of mapping it out can be really powerful.
Right. And the book actually gives you a specific exercise for doing this.
Yeah.
The TBR,
Oh, okay.
trigger behavior result.
Right, yeah.
So you, the listener, you can actually try this out for yourself.
Okay, that's cool.
But there's a word of warning.
Okay.
Once you start to see these loops, it's really hard to unsee.
You can't just ignore them anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there's this temptation to try and fix them right away.
Oh, yeah, to just jump in and solve it.
But that can actually backfire.
Okay.
The book calls it the trying to fix it habit loop.
Right.
We fall back on these old strategies that haven't really worked for us in the past.
Yeah, it's like we get frustrated that we're not seeing results immediately.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like, you hear a weird noise in your car.
Yeah.
You take it to the mechanic. They tell you what's wrong.
Yeah.
And then you try to fix it yourself without really knowing what you're doing.
Right.
You might end up making it worse.
Yeah.
So first gear is really about building that awareness. It's about noticing those loops, not necessarily trying to change them right away.
It's like laying the groundwork.
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So what are some of the triggers that you notice in your own life?
Yeah, what are the things that tend to set off your anxiety?
What are the behaviors that you engage in when you feel anxious?
And what are the results of those behaviors?
Just starting to notice those things is what first gear is all about.
Okay, so that's first gear. Now let's shift into second gear.
Okay.
Updating reward value.
Now we're getting into the real work of changing those habits.
Okay. How so?
Second gear is about directly experiencing the results of our behaviors
Okay.
so that we can update how rewarding they actually are in our brains.
Okay.
Like if you mindlessly eat a whole bag of chips
Yeah.
and then you feel sick,
Yeah.
that physical experience helps to update the reward value of that behavior.
Right. It's like, okay, maybe those chips weren't as rewarding as I thought they were.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about going beyond just knowing intellectually that something is bad for you
Yeah.
and actually feeling the consequences.
Right. Yeah.
Because intellectual knowledge alone often isn't enough to change our habits.
Right.
We need to engage those reward-based learning centers in our brain.
Oh,
And
okay.
the book calls it your brain coach.
Okay, cool.
And it's not about these big dramatic moments.
Okay.
It's about those short moments many times
Okay.
throughout the day.
Okay, yeah.
Brewer tells this story about how he was putting honey in his tea,
Okay.
and he just absentmindedly put the whole teaspoon in his mouth.
Oh, wow.
And he realized it didn't even taste that good.
Right.
Just that little moment of awareness
Mhm.
helped him to update the reward value of that sugar craving.
Yeah. It's like he caught himself in the act.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there's this thing called retrospective second gear.
Okay, what's that?
It's basically learning from our past experiences.
Okay.
So even if you do engage in the habit, if you can go back and really feel the negative consequences,
Yeah.
it can help to weaken that habit.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's important to have a growth mindset here.
Okay, like Carol Dweck's work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about seeing those slip-ups as learning opportunities.
Right, not as failures.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's this really cool study that Dr. Small did with chocolate.
Okay.
He showed that even a food that people love
Yeah.
can become disgusting if they eat too much of it.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah. And it turns out that the same part of the brain that's active when we crave something
Yeah.
is also active when we're disgusted by it.
Oh, that's so interesting.
It's like this weird duality.
Yeah.
So the bottom line is that our feelings are more powerful than our thoughts when it comes to changing habits.
Okay, so we have to actually experience the consequences to really make a change.
Exactly.
Second gear is all about paying attention to how those anxiety-driven behaviors actually make you feel.
Right. It's about letting your experience be your teacher.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've mapped our minds. We're updating reward values.
Now what?
Now it's time for third gear. Finding the bigger, better offer.
This is where we start to replace those old habits with something more rewarding.
Okay, what kinds of things are we talking about?
Brewer talks about mindfulness itself,
Okay.
curiosity, and kindness.
Okay.
He says that just substituting one external reward for another,
Okay.
like trading smoking for watching puppy videos,
Yeah.
often doesn't work in the long run.
Right.
Because you habituate to the new reward.
Yeah, it's like you need more and more of it to get the same effect.
Right. It's like this hungry ghost phenomenon.
Oh, okay.
You're always searching for something to fill that void.
Yeah.
But curiosity and kindness are different.
Okay.
They're intrinsically rewarding.
What does that mean?
It means they feel good in and of themselves.
Okay.
They're not about getting something external.
Okay.
They're about the experience itself.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So there are two types of curiosity. Eye curiosity, which is like interest,
Okay.
and decuriosity, which is more like deprivation. Like you need to know something to fill a gap.
Yeah.
And curiosity follows this Goldilocks rule.
Okay.
Not too little uncertainty, not too much.
Right. You need just the right amount.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Brewer says we often approach our anxiety with decuriosity.
Okay.
Like it's a problem to be solved.
Right.
But in third gear, we want to cultivate curiosity.
Okay. So be more interested in it
Right.
instead of trying to get rid of it.
Exactly.
Okay, yeah.
So instead of trying to suppress your anxiety, you just get curious about it.
Yeah.
And what does it feel like? What are the thoughts that are coming up?
Yeah.
And this curiosity actually becomes the bigger, better offer.
Oh.
It draws your attention away from the anxiety.
It's like a distraction, but a good one.
Right.
Yeah.
The book talks about this mantra.
Okay.
It's a way to step into the present moment
Okay.
and just observe your experience with curiosity.
Without judgment.
Without judgment. Yeah. And you can even bring curiosity into second gear
Okay. How so?
by asking yourself, what am I getting from this anxious thought or behavior?
Oh, interesting.
It helps you to learn from your experience.
Yeah. That makes sense.
There's this story in the book about a guy named Dave
Okay.
who used curiosity to understand his anxiety, which was rooted in childhood trauma.
Oh, wow.
By approaching those feelings with curiosity instead of avoidance,
Yeah.
he was able to start to heal.
That's amazing.
So the book gives us some tools for putting this into practice.
Okay.
There's the RAIN practice.
Okay. What's that?
Recognize, allow, investigate, note.
Okay.
It's a way to stay present during moments of anxiety.
Okay.
You just observe the sensations, the thoughts, the emotions
Without getting swept away by it.
without getting swept away.
Yeah.
And then there's the loving kindness practice.
Okay.
This is about cultivating feelings of warmth and kindness
Okay.
towards yourself and others.
Yeah.
The book even talks about using the sound of honking cars as a reminder to practice loving kindness.
Oh, that's interesting
Yeah.
because usually that would be something that would make you angry,
Exactly.
but you're using it as a trigger for kindness.
Right.
That's a cool idea.
Yeah.
And there's this really powerful story about a woman who was struggling with binge eating,
Oh, yeah.
and she found relief by addressing her self-judgment and practicing loving kindness.
It's amazing how much our own self-criticism can fuel our anxiety.
Yeah, for sure.
And then there's this other woman, Amy.
Okay.
She had this habit of asking herself, why, all the time.
Oh.
Like, why am I feeling this way?
Yeah.
And it was actually making her anxiety worse.
Because she was getting stuck in her head.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So she did this exercise called Why Doesn't Matter,
Okay.
which helped her to focus on the present moment
Okay.
instead of getting lost in trying to figure out the reasons for her anxiety.
So it's about shifting your focus.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there's noting practice.
Right.
This is about paying attention to your five senses,
Okay.
your internal bodily sensations,
Okay.
and your thoughts.
Okay.
It's a way to build mindfulness throughout the day.
Okay.
And all of these practices go back to Brewer's experience with panic attacks.
Yeah.
He realized that mindfulness allowed him to observe those thoughts and sensations
Yeah.
without getting carried away by them,
Right.
which prevented those negative associations from forming.
Oh, that's really interesting.
So it's all about those short moments many times.
Yeah, consistency is key.
Consistency is key.
Yeah. And what I really like about curiosity and kindness is that they're intrinsically rewarding.
Right. You don't have to force yourself to do them.
Yeah, they feel good.
They feel good.
Yeah.
And the book even suggests using the memory of positive feelings
Okay.
as a way to motivate yourself.
Oh, interesting.
Like remembering how good you felt after a run or after doing something kind for someone.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So the book talks about building evidence-based faith. It's different from just taking a leap of faith.
Okay. How so?
It's about gathering evidence from your own experience.
Okay.
Every
Yeah.
time you practice these techniques
Yeah.
and you see that they work,
Yeah.
you're building that evidence.
It's like you're becoming your own experiment.
Right.
Yeah.
And then when doubts come up,
Yeah.
you can look back and say, hey, this has worked for me before.
Right. Yeah.
There's this quote from a participant in the Eat Right Now program
Okay.
that really stuck with me.
Okay.
He said that it's about diligence and faith,
Okay.
but that faith is built on experience.
Okay.
It's not just blind faith.
Right. It's based on something real.
Right.
Yeah.
And Brewer even talks about his own struggles with procrastination
Oh, interesting.
and how he found joy in writing by tapping into his interest and knowledge and experience.
Okay.
He calls it flow.
Yeah.
And he says that the process of writing his books, The Craving Mind and Unwinding Anxiety,
Yeah.
was a great example of this for him.
Wow, that's cool.
And he emphasizes the importance of focusing on the present moment.
Yeah.
He quotes Randy Armstrong, who said, "Worrying does not take away tomorrow's troubles, it takes away today's peace."
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then the book gets into this idea of the extremism of kindness.
Okay, that's interesting.
Brewer talks about how he tends towards extremes
Okay.
and how that led him to explore anxiety and kindness.
Okay.
He mentions Charles Darwin,
Okay.
who observed that communities with more empathetic members
Yeah.
were more likely to survive.
Oh, that makes sense.
So from an evolutionary perspective,
Yeah.
kindness might actually be more advantageous than meanness.
Yeah, it's like cooperation versus competition.
Right.
Yeah.
And Brewer's lab did some research
Okay.
that showed that people consistently prefer mental states like kindness and curiosity
Yeah.
over anxiety and anger.
Okay.
So kindness isn't just a nice thing to do.
Yeah.
It's actually more rewarding for our brains.
So it benefits us too.
Exactly. So Brewer calls himself a kindness extremist,
Okay.
and he challenges us to think about what kind of extremist we want to be.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. To make kindness our default setting.
Right. It's
Yeah.
like, what are we going to be extreme about?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a good question.
And the book ends with this really inspiring story about Congressman Tim Ryan
Okay.
and one of his staff members, Michael, who used the Craving to Quit app
Okay.
to stop smoking.
Wow.
It's a real-world example
Yeah.
of how these techniques can make a difference.
Yeah, that's really cool.
And finally, Brewer talks about the inspiration for the book.
Okay.
He dedicates it to Amazon addict,
Yeah.
who left a critical review of his previous book, The Craving Mind.
Oh, wow.
They said that he was withholding information.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and that actually spurred him to write Unwinding Anxiety.
Wow, so it's like constructive criticism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It showed him that people needed more guidance, not just information.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
So to wrap things up,
Yeah.
we've learned that anxiety often comes from uncertainty
Right.
and that it can become a habit.
Right.
The first step is to become aware of those habits.
That's first gear, mapping your mind.
right. Then we need to update the reward value of those habits.
Second gear.
Right,
Yeah.
by experiencing the consequences.
Yeah.
And finally, we need to find bigger, better offers.
Third gear.
Right.
Yeah, like curiosity and kindness.
Exactly.
So you now have all this information from unwinding anxiety.
Yeah.
You can use it to start to understand and work with your own anxiety.
Well, it's like having a toolbox.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And remember that image of the violin string?
Yeah.
It's just slightly out of tune.
Right.
You can use these tools to retune yourself.
Exactly.
This deep dive is just the beginning.
Yeah.
Think about what resonated with you.
What stood out to you?
Yeah.
What are you going to try out in your own life?
Yeah. And here's a final thought for you. Now that you understand how your brain creates these anxiety habits,
Yeah.
what's one small act of curiosity or kindness that you can bring to your experience of anxiety the next time it shows up?
That's a good one.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's all about those little moments.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that's a good place to end it.
Yeah, that was a good deep dive.
Yeah, it was fun.
I learned a lot.
Yeah, me too.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah.
All right, see you next time.